So welcome everyone to the second part to Martin Sief's Kropotkin, the Anarchist International and the Assassination of Tsar Alexander II and President McKinley. Last week, we had the pleasure of listening to Martin Sief go over the London Anarchist Conference of 1881 and the relevance of Prince Kropotkin's role in all of that. It's a popular historical view today that the wave of anarchist-led assassinations that occurred in the late 19th and 20th century were committed as isolated grassroots events. Martin Sief is going to go over why that's a completely false view of what happened in history. And in particular, he's going to be focusing around what caused the assassination of Tsar Alexander II and President McKinley. So you can go ahead, Martin.
Thank you as always, Cynthia. Now, first of all, since as you all I think know all too well, I go all over the place, there are several loose ends I left dangling last week, and I want to tie them up first before we go on. And in so doing, actually, I think we lay more of a foundation for what we're going to do here. First, I'm going to tie up these loose ends. Then I'm going to give you the early life, ultimately the full life, of Peter Kropotkin, a most important and crucial and utterly misunderstood man, which is amazing since he hid in plain sight. There is no excuse for this. You can't. It is deeper, much deeper than the manipulation of history. It is what people want to believe. It is what supposedly serious intellectuals want their fairy tales to be. The great English Christian conservative writer G.K. Chesterton, who had many unpleasant things about him, genuinely unpleasant, but he's one of these people, again, you have to keep coming back to him because of the solidness of key things he said. One of them was when people stop believing in God, especially in the relatively mainstream Christian and classical Greek tradition, they start believing in anything. And that, of course, is what we see. We do not see rationality as Voltaire liked to his credit, like and my old teacher, Isaiah Berlin, hoped the world to be, though Berlin very much, even by the time he was in his 40s, knew very well and made no secret of his knowing that the world was not rational that way. People believe what they want to believe. Now, a couple of loose ends from last week. I have a couple of mental blocks, and I apologize to you for them. I'm sure I'll have more. It goes with the age. First, when I referred to an American president who was assassinated, never mentioned him by name, I was, of course, referring to James Garfield in 1881. That's the first point. And you'll recall I was stressing the point that 1881 was the year zero. An amazing lot of things happened in 1881. In the first half of 1881 in very quick succession. That's the first point. Secondly, I refer to Benjamin Disraeli and his suspicious death, which I will be touching on further here. But that led me to another suspicious death, to my own astonishment. And again, those of you who have seen my previous lectures, or I've discussed with, I did not come into this subject by choice or by passion, and I was certainly not looking for conspiracies. That's the irony of it. I've been astonished at the patterns that I found, and they're up there, as we'll see today, leaping at you in public. Benjamin Disraeli was not a protectionist until except for two periods in his life. Early in his career, when he first became leader of the Conservative Party in Britain in the 1840s, succeeding the frightful Robert Peel, who had serious responsibility for the catastrophic famine in Ireland, very much an Edward Heath character, one of these, or a Donald Rumsfeld one of these genius, or Paul Wolfowitz, they're all the same, brilliant intellectuals in their own imagination, who simply utterly screw up everything they touch, everything they touch. Dominic Commons, who lasted less than a year and a half as the the powerful chief confidential political advisor of Prime Minister Boris Johnson in Britain, is another buffoon and idiot, very much in that category. But Disraeli is a protectionist in the 1840s, and as we shall see, in what may have bearing on his unexpected death in 1881, he becomes that way under the influence of a figure a very unlikely figure, very well known to all of us here, who I touched on last week and shall touch on again here, Otto von Bismarck. But in the 1840s, while Disraeli is not into economics or business, he's chronically in debt all his life. He's a political genius. And he is a much more humane figure for suffering human beings, especially in the English industrial working class, than any individual on the liberal side, following Earl Russell or Earl Grey or the frightful William Ewart Gladstone are. His book on the two nations in the 1840s is a prophetic vision. And his government from 1874 to 1880 has more advanced social legislation, including limiting the working day, giving trade unions effective rights in Britain for the first time in history in any major Western industrial society, than any government until 1905 carries out in the entire history of England. And Disraeli single-handedly in that government in 1874 rolls back a monstrous wave of repression that Whigs, liberal imperialists, had imposed on the English people and the Scottish people for quite literally 150 years before his time. Then he dies. But how does he become leader of the Conservative Party? He is the best friend, as I said, of the fellow who came before him and died quickly. But I forgot his name last week. And my God, he deserves to be remembered. He was a colorful fellow called Lord George Bentinck, Bentinck. And he and Dizzy were lifelong bosom friends. It was basically he who brought Disraeli, who up to that point was largely seen as an unprincipled, sleazy, and worst of all, Jewish adventurer, and flamboyantly Jewish at that, in the House of Commons. And it's he who brings him not just into the Conservative Party, but to the very top of the Conservative Party. Bentinck was continually in massive debts himself. He was for most of his life famous for running a stud of racing horses at the time when the turf, when thoroughbred horse racing in Britain was quite simply the most profitable and fanatically popular sport in England and in fact in the whole world to that time. And he spent what today would be the equivalent of $100 million on his breeding stables and his line of champion racehorses alone. He was also a very fiery, ferocious man. He was probably quietly or oppressively gay. There's almost no hint of any romantic interest with any ladies whatsoever in his life. He leads the Conservative Party for only 2 years, but it turns out that in economics, he is brilliant. He is quite literally 90 years ahead of his time in championing protectionism to protect the British economy from the rising challenges of Germany and the United States in particular. And had he lived with Disraeli by his side, the great long industrial decline of England, for better or worse, or both, would never have happened. Because he sees these policies clearly. And his bosom friend Dizzy, while loyal to him, simply does not have that clarity and brilliance in the economic sphere when it comes to diplomacy, strategy, manipulating Queen Victoria, appealing to the British public who are so different from him. Disraeli is a political genius, but not when it comes to practical business and economics. Doesn't know anything. The one further thing I'll add about Bentinck is, what is his background that gives him this? It's the same as Bismarck's in Germany. He is a wealthy landowner, but he isn't so wealthy that he can't afford to live off his capital. He has to make profits from his estates and from his racing stables. So the price of grain and the ability to sell grain at a profit and to make profits on the land and to employ working peasants and agricultural workers, as for Bismarck, is practically important to him. And in Germany in the 1870s, this practical experience of Bismarck leads Bismarck to defy every liberal economist in Germany and in France and in England and in America at that time, and the whole Cobden free trade myth. And Bismarck spits in their face, and he creates the most successful industrial protected economy the world has seen to this point. And Bentinck could have done it for England 30 years before. But something familiar to us in this seminar happens. Bentinck dies. In 1848, he takes a walk from his estate a 12-mile walk, but he's an energetic fellow, and he only makes it half the way and his body is found the next day. I found to my fascination that there were widespread conspiracy theories of murder at that time. Not so much from the liberals as from fellow horse breeders who he had endless ferocious rows and business arguments with, and major and expensive legal conflicts with. An autopsy was done. There is no serious reason, from what I can tell, to doubt the effects of the autopsy. He appears to have died from a heart attack. And in fact, remember, this is the age before cell phones or any kinds of phones yet. The telegraph, electric telegraph, has in fact been invented in one case by an American poet, Samuel Wheatstone of all things, living in England. A very improbable visionary for this, but it's only slowly coming into play. But there is speculation at the time of poisoning, and a few years later, a sinister Victorian doctor who is executed, is hanged for poisoning so many of his patients, in some cases for naked greed, and in other cases simply because he liked killing people. His name is Palmer. And he becomes one of the most notorious poisoners in the myths of the 19th century. Victorian England, like modern England, especially in the golden era of crime under Agatha Christie and Dorothy Sayers and Arthur Conan Doyle, there is an endless passion, which of course I grew up with and share, for sensational murder cases, and Palmer is one. But Palmer's name is even connected, at least in speculation, with the death of Lord George Bentinck. Bentinck has only led the Conservative Party for 2 years. He is only 46 years old when he dies. Now, in fact, he has the psychological type, which today was not recognized at the time, but today would make him a classic example, prime candidate for a fatal, devastating heart attack. He was emotionally out of control, fiery. He reveled in screaming fits and rows with people all the time. He flourished on it. It brought him to the top of the Conservative Party. But he was also Benjamin Disraeli's closest friend. And Disraeli thought so much of him that he got the job of writing a 2-volume biography of him right after his friend died. Now, Disraeli was actually one of the finest novelists in England. We'll get back to this later because it has an unusual bearing on our story. In 19th century England, he was almost as popular as Dickens. He was more popular than Trollope. Critics don't like his novels, but they are stylish and witty and politically extraordinarily sophisticated, and also in some cases wildly romantic. He is a real talent, and he brings this to his book on Bentinck. But the other key thing is the great strike against Disraeli, which eventually he proved to be false and outlived, was that he was a cynic, that he would buy and even a sociopath, that he really didn't care about anybody or anything. And I mean, look at this, a flamboyant, obvious Jew who is never bothers to pretend he's believing Christian. He was baptized when he was a boy by his father, who was a converted Jew, just in order to get on in the world. And Dizzy doesn't take it seriously at all. When he's asked in Parliament on one occasion by Daniel O'Connell, the famous Irish leader, who was also incidentally a notorious anti-Semite and hated Disraeli, what is your religion truly, Mr. Disraeli? And Dizzy, of course, ducks the question with Oscar Wilde class wit. Why, he says, my religion is the religion of all sensible men. And what, pray, is that, Mr. Disraeli? O'Connell asks, pressing the point. He wants him to admit he's a Marano, a secret Jew, right? Therefore discrediting him with the conservative Tory local farm owners who at the end of his life are the backbone of his loyal support, improbably enough, but they are. And Disraeli says, well, my religion is the religion of all sensible men, and we have praised that, Mr. Disraeli. Sensible men never tell. It's a response worthy of Ben Franklin at his most tolerant and wisest and best. And that's the kind of man Disraeli is. Tolerant, wise, shrewd, with wit, and a cynic. But he loved George Bentinck. And his book on him is worth reading for this reason. It is a loving book. It is written by a man who is still grieving his best friend. And it tells the lie to those who say, Disraeli actually had a huge heart, but he hid it well. And his public style was, the Anglo-English gentleman who is also this extraordinary Semitic figure, and he plays up the Jewish aspect. And a couple of his novels have bizarre semi-messianic heroes who set up empires in the Middle East, both in modern times and even today, and bring the Jews back to Palestine and die tragically and gloriously. Disraeli is not a Herzl. He is not a political revolutionary or a political Jewish nationalist leader. He does revere and serve the British Empire, but he's a romantic at the same time. But Bentinck is well worth looking at, and the death of Bentinck is extremely well worth looking at. Because you see here again, wherever we look, and we'll find a couple more cases as we go on here, we do not find just assassinations. We also find unexpected and suspicious deaths. I'll give you another one. I'm going to be talking about Tsar Alexander II tonight, who was murdered, obviously, and ferociously and flamboyantly even, at the age of 63 on the streets of St. Petersburg. But his son, Tsar Alexander III, reigns only 13 years, and then he dies. But he's only 46 to 49 years old himself. He's hardly older than George Bentinck when he dies. And it's a very unexpected death. And that's all you hear about it. And Alexander III he is not a liberal as his father was, as we shall see, but he has confounded British interests for 13 years, very unexpectedly, by continuing several of his father's most core policies, most centrally industrialization and railroad development, and centralized industrial expansion of the Russian economy, which flourishes under him. You see, the expectation of the revolutionaries who killed Tsar Alexander II and of the people behind them was that Russia would fall apart once Alexander II was dead. But of course it didn't. Many of the same crucial policies are continued under his extremely effective and reactionary son. And then the son himself also unexpectedly dies, a death in 1894 that clears the way for an idiot, which he is, the last of the Tsars, Nikolai II. And this death has never been looked at skeptically by anyone. And I remember last week, an important digression I made, which we will be going into here too, was the nature of soft power. Soft power prepares the way for revolution and justifies it and excuses it, as we have just seen it fail to do, but clearly it was attempted to do in Belarus and Kazakhstan, and it is now being targeted at Russia. This is very clear, and it's certainly being targeted through the Uyghurs and Hong Kong at the government of China. But also after the event, soft power, the control of respected international media, and the prestige of globally respected scholars and historians is used after the event to cover up assassinations, criminal bungles, you name it. Classic example of this you can find online. There's a very useful British website about debates in history. And one of the debates is, should England have entered World War I? Now, from my perspective, being both British and Irish, and in this case, wearing my old traditional British hat, in fact, my Irish hat too, there is absolutely no question about this. Of course, Britain and Ireland should never have entered World War I. Neither of them. I've gone into this in previous lectures, maybe in future ones. The hecatomb of death in Britain was catastrophic. This is what destroyed the British Empire. How can you keep an empire going when 2 million of its most passionate and loyal defenders who volunteer to fight for it in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Ireland, in England, are all thrown, their precious lives are all thrown away by Sir Douglas Haig on the Western Front? And yet only 4 individuals, one of whom is Winston Churchill, and another whom is the First World War Premier David Lloyd George, are responsible for this. But in this debate among historians, who do we find defending the need to go into the war in 1914? And she does it very brilliantly and very successfully. And she's a beautiful writer, and she's no fool, but she is utterly biased. Professor Margaret Macmillan, one of Canada's most revered and influential historians today. But who is Margaret Macmillan? Why, she's the granddaughter of David Lloyd George, one of the cabal of 4 people who brought England into the war in the first place in 1914. And Winston Churchill was another. It is a small world, isn't it? It's a small world. Now, I wanted to tie up those loose ends, and there is one much bigger loose end, which is much more direct to us now. In all my talk and flailing around last week about the first anarchist international conference, I spent a lot of time, and it was important time and valuable, how Marxist historians, who are the most influential writers in this area, have been incompetent idiots for the past 120 and more years. They missed the point entirely. Everything they have written about the 1881 Congress in London has been theoretical and ideological with their beloved dialectic. They love to split hairs and show how it's not true to Marx. That's all they damn well care about. And this is true. But was therefore the conference intellectually coherent and a waste of time? No, the conference was an enormous success. It was such an enormous success that no further international congress comparable to it. There are some smaller ones which are attempted, and most of them are never even organized. And the 1 or 2 that are very faint echoes of it. And yet the movement continues to apparently gain speed and operate with impunity around the world, even though it is never a mass movement, as I went to lengths pointing out last week. In other words, the structure that came and movement and ideas that came out of 1881 in London, 7 days in London, July the 14th to July the 20th inclusive, 7 days in London in 1881, keep the anarchist movement going for 20 years. Now, you couldn't contrast that with the endless movements of the conferences that the Marxists of different kinds had before the Russian Revolution. That, of course, are dealt with by both the Stalinists and the Trotskyists and the Leninists, and even the democratic socialists like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who are light years ahead of these people, but they still are Marxists, and they think in Marxist terms, so ideology is important to them. What actually happened? What was done during those 7 days in the London conference? They were discussing modalities of murder. They were discussing how to kill people and how to operate cells. And they had a successful model to work with, which was they'd finally managed to kill the Tsar after 6 unsuccessful attempts. But also the record in the 1870s before that was one of continual failure. They had tried twice in 1 year to assassinate the Emperor of Germany, Wilhelm I, and they had also tried, and these were serious murder attempts, to kill Otto von Bismarck himself, and they had failed in each case. So obviously they needed better methodologies. And that is what they focused on in the conference, and that is why the Marxists are not concerned about this. Because with one individual exception, all the Marxist theoreticians of the last quarter of the 19th century and up to the Russian Revolution are men of thought, of intellectual, abstract ideas. The actual mechanics of conspiracy, how to hide from the police, how to arm your people, how to pierce lines of protection of the security services. Should you get people to stab? Or they don't seem to have had any faith in rifle shots from long distance. It's always either pistols at point blank range or bombs. That's usually the way it's done. But they study these things. And at long last, they have a successful prototype to study. Only 3-4 months before, in March 1881, right before Benjamin Disraeli falls sick, and he dies the following month in April 1881, we have the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. Do we not? And in July, we have, under the leadership of the man who was directly responsible, as we shall see tonight, for masterminding and directing the murder cell directly through his cut off, Sophia, I have her name written down, Perovskaya, correct me on that, a lady of great importance, who can be connected personally, directly with Kropotkin as early as 1872, 9 years before the assassination. And this is common knowledge. It's never been hidden. It's never been secret. But again, the power of brainwashing people with soft power. If you don't think to ask the right questions, the truth will be staring you in the face and you'll never recognize it. The greatest of all science fiction writers, Philip K. Dick, a man who made Kafka look like he's writing a popular fiction at age 10 by contrast, asks the question in one of his novels, I think it's Time Out of Joint, where is the best place to hide a tree? Conventional answer is well known. You hide a tree in the forest. And Dick says, yeah, not bad, but not the best. Because if you're really out to find that tree, you just cut down every other tree in that forest till you find the tree. I've got a much better idea. You leave the tree standing where it is, and you hang a sign on it saying, I am a lamppost. And everybody will read the sign, and they will say, oh, what a wonderful design for a lamppost, looks just like a tree. And this is where Madison Avenue brainwashing comes from in the 1920s onwards. And as I learned from you, Matt, and you, Cynthia, I didn't know this before at all, though again, it's public domain knowledge that nobody bothers looking at. Sigmund Freud's own, I think his son-in-law, one of his sons-in-law, becomes one of the leading executives on Madison Avenue in the 1920s and one of the pioneers of advertising and conditioning theory, a subject which, of course, is of the greatest interest to Aldous Huxley all his life. This is the value of soft power. Even 100 years after the event, it conditions us not to see what should be staring us in the face. And what should be staring us in the face is the basic reality of what the first anarchist congress in London in 1881 in the heart of the British Empire, held in public, was all about. It was about murder. It was about how to commit murder. And it is so successful that it establishes a template for organization and execution for the anarchist movement that is successfully replicated in all the ensuing successful assassinations of the 1880s and the 1890s that you, Matt, and you, Cynthia, and Anton have all documented for us. This cannot be emphasized strongly enough. And who is the architect of this? Why, it is the man who succeeds the founder of the anarchist movement, Mikhail Bakunin, on Bakunin's death in 1876. And that is Kropotkin. Who is Kropotkin? First, one of the few pieces of truth about Kropotkin is that he really was a fabulously wealthy aristocrat. He claims to be, and his family claimed to be, as I mentioned last week, from the House of Rurik, the mythical founding house of the Russian monarchy. More sacred blood and more endowed to rule than the Romanovs themselves. The Romanovs are parvenus. They're newcomers. They've only ruled Russia for 280 years by 1881. Their family starts after the death of Tsar Boris Godunov, after the time of troubles in 1603 to 1612. The Romanovs are parvenus. But the House of Rurik is the founding royal family of Rus, back even when it was Kievan Rus, back in the 9th century AD. They go back all the way. Now, if Kropotkin's line, in fact, came from them, as it may have done, it would have been a cadet line. And most likely or not, he was not directly descended from them at all. But he liked to think he was, and it is central to his mystique. It is central to his mystique. He is given not just a regular elite education, but there is a weird twisted echo of Moses in Egypt. And as is so often the case, the stories in the Bible turn out to be templates or archetypes, if you prefer, or prototypes for human behavior and experience endlessly repeated throughout history. The man who leads the Jewish slaves, the Israelite slaves, out of hundreds of years of slavery in Egypt, is raised as an Egyptian aristocrat. Moses, is he not? And Kropotkin, who is determined to destroy not just Tsarism in Russia, but every monarchy and capitalist system in the whole world, except, of course, for that in England, the biggest and most powerful and most oppressive of them all. Far more oppressive and genocidal than anything the Russian Empire had gotten up to. Far more. We can go into the detail on that either late in this, but of course I diverge often enough. If anybody wants to make a note on this and then ask me to document this, I can do so in 5 minutes in our Q&A discussion afterwards. But Kropotkin is from one of the wealthiest families in Russia. His family owns hundreds of serfs, possibly thousands, certainly hundreds, right? And more than that, he is an exceptionally handsome boy. He's a beautiful boy, and this will turn out to be very important in the darkest of ways, even before the age of puberty. So he is sent to be a member of the Page Corps, the elite children of the Russian aristocracy who are sent to serve in the Tsar's court and to learn how to be future ruling aristocrats of Russia. It really doesn't work very well. Already, Alexander I had set up the first organized lyceum, or organized school for Russian, brilliant Russian students of every background in St. Petersburg in 1800. And they become the first wave of revolutionaries. 25 years later, in the Decembrist fizzled revolt, which again is not a revolt from the masses, but a revolt of a handful of elite intellectuals against the accession of Nikolai I, the Tsar, on the supposed death. And it being Russia, of course, there are much more rich and extraordinary stories, which I believe are true, behind the disappearance of Alexander I. He is not removed, he chooses to remove himself. If anyone wants any follow-up on this, ask me and I will go into that too. The story is extraordinary, but well documented and quickly told. But Alexander I sets up this school to teach the best of Western thought and philosophy and humanism and education to the Russian elite in 1800. And the problem, of course, is he succeeds. He succeeds too well. They will become revolutionaries. Alexander II Kropotkin, young Peter Kropotkin becomes a page in the court of Tsar Alexander. Actually, it would have been first in the court of Tsar Nikolai I. And then afterwards, he serves Alexander II in his early years. But at this point, he's still a teenager. He's 15 to 17 years old when he serves the great Tsar. And he never talks about this afterwards, but it is very clear that this is the driving motivational force of his life. Why? Because he develops an inconceivable hatred, not just of the institution of Tsarism or of hereditary empire and courts in any country, which he spends the rest of his life dedicated to eradicating. But his hatred is of the Tsar personally. Why? Is the Tsar a monster? Does he believe in beating people? No, he does not. And here again, we look at the record of Alexander II and how it has been Anglo-American soft liberal power has completely extinguished this record. And of course, the Marxists are eager to ignore it too. Because Tsar Alexander II liberates 24 million human beings, 6 times the number of people that Nikita Khrushchev frees from the Gulag, as I mentioned last week. Right? He is one of the greatest liberators in human history. He frees 3 times 8. Yes, Abraham Lincoln frees 3 million slaves. Tsar Alexander frees 24 million slaves. He also reveres Lincoln and supports Lincoln. He protects and saves the American Union. He sends fleets of the Russian Navy to New York City and Boston, mainly to New York, and another squadron to San Francisco to protect the eastern and western coast of the United States and to deter the British and French navies from intervening on the side of the Confederacy to ensure that the Confederacy becomes an independent nation. And had he not done so, the Confederacy would have received this aid from their great admirer, William Ewart Gladstone, who was Finance Minister of Britain and de facto Prime Minister of England under Lord Palmerston, who also hates, as I discussed last week, the United States of America like poison. And none of this, in all my years of one of the most outstanding schools in Britain, and then taking 2 degrees in history, both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree over 7 years from Oxford University, I never came across once, not just in books, but from any of my teachers, who are personally people of the greatest education and knowledge and integrity as well. But soft power had woven its magic spell over them. They were conditioned without realizing it. Tsar Alexander II, the myth is, reverted to being a repressive tyrant for years before he died, so it's good that he died. What was the Tsar going to do the day after, the following day, when in fact he died in agony? Had the bomb not been thrown, what was his plan for that day? His plan was to sign an ukase, an imperial decree, turning Russia into a constitutional parliamentary monarchy, actually on British and German lines. On British and German lines. And he could not be allowed to do it, not just by the British Secret Service, but by his own deep state, the Okhrana. Because the Russian Revolution that came in 1917 appeared to be coming in 1867 and 68. I mentioned this to you last week, I do it again. There is one key book by Fyodor Dostoyevsky, greatest of all Russian novelists, and to my mind, somebody the greatest novelist who ever lived. Go back and suck on your baby comforter Tolstoy. You aren't in this class. The Devils, the Possessed. A book about how liberalism leads to destructive revolutionary nihilism that will destroy entire societies and civilizations. That is what Stavrogan is. And the figure of the self-destructive imperialist man, as I said last week, that Stavrogan is, does not even start with Stavrogan. Dostoevsky, who is enormously well-read, acknowledges this. He says, I got it from Dickens, the character of Steerforth, the handsome, dashing, everybody loves him, charismatic, brilliant, talented, wonderful sportsman, wealthy, beloved of his mother, and self-destructive and doomed figure in David Copperfield. And where does Dickens get it from? Why, he gets it from Shakespeare Marlowe himself. We are talking about Hamlet. And I will happily volunteer to give another lecture simply on one of Shakespeare's plays alone, because the implications on this are enormous for history, politics, psychology, and world literature. And it is why did Shakespeare or Marlowe make Hamlet the way he is? Why is Hamlet such a puzzling figure? And most puzzling of all, why does Shakespeare revere Hamlet and have everybody agree that Hamlet is the most wonderful, perfect, beautiful, sweet, ideal prince, when he's obviously a self-destructive asshole? My personal favorite Hamlet of all time is Mel Gibson. precisely because of his limitations. Bless you, Cynthia, you're ahead of me, as usual. Both of you always are, we all know that. But again, you know, I'm old, but you know, I don't find it a shame to acknowledge I get the bronze medal rather than the gold in intellectual races like this. You were both way ahead of me long before I came to this. But it puzzled me at the time. I loved Gibson in this. And there's lots of things I don't love Gibson for. But he is a talent. I mean, a very self-destructive talent. And the sadomasochism in every one of his movies is just wildly off the scale. I mean, I love Steven Seagal too, but Steven Seagal is a benign figure compared with Mel Gibson. But Gibson is an intuitive genius. He really is an intuitive genius. You see it in The Passion of the Christ. In many respects, a dark movie, but brilliantly done. Brilliantly done. But he zeroes in on Hamlet. And why does Shakespeare love him? Because he loved the reality that this guy is based on. The illegitimate son of Queen Elizabeth I, who she was forced to execute and behead, the Earl of Essex. Now, from an Irish point of view, of course, it's much easier to stand back against the Earl of Essex because he's responsible for the second of Queen Elizabeth's genocides. One wasn't enough for her against the Irish people. They quite literally slaughtered millions of people on each occasion. And by the time the great Queen was dead, half the Irish people were dead before her. And this is 250 years before the Great Famine. Before the Great Famine. So we come back to Russia. We come back to the 1860s. Why is Dostoyevsky so concerned about revolution in the 1860s? Because the reform movements under Alexander II appear to have gotten out of control. And everybody is openly talking about revolution and destroying the Tsar. And the intellectual atmosphere is already reminiscent of the French Revolution after, not in 1776, after the American Revolution, or when Louis XVI has just taken the throne, but right when the three estates are already meeting and revolution and the 1,000-year monarchy in France is already palpably shifting and breaking from its moorings. And this is the intellectual atmosphere in St. Petersburg in 1865, 1867, and 68, when Dostoevsky writes that book. And remember also, Dostoevsky writes that book because Sergei Nechayev, another self-destructive figure who he bases Stavrogan on, has written the Revolutionary Testament. And the best place to read about this that I recommend to you is, again, a forgotten historical biographer who is my favorite historical biographer of the 20th century. Everyone he writes about brilliantly. His name was Robert Payne, P-A-Y-N-E. He writes enormous 800-page biographies of Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Churchill, Gandhi, and Hitler. And he's amazingly good. You will find insights and wisdom in these books, in his books, that you will find nowhere else. And when he talks about Lenin and Stalin, he starts with Nechayev. And he recognizes that Dostoevsky gets his understanding of the psychology of the completely destructive revolutionary from Nechayev's Revolutionary Testament in the 1870s and late 1860s. This is what Alexander II's reforms appear to have come to. They are a liberal dream gone mad, and they've turned into a conservative nightmare. Now, in fact, Alexander is better than that. What does he actually really do? He brings Western education to the Russian Empire in a way never before seen. We think of Russian schools, especially in the Tsarist era, as being inherently brutal. And up to the 1840s, they murderously were. They got more brutal in the 19th century. Actually, it's the same pattern you see in England. Many of the most repressive aspects of English society that crush people in the 18th and 19th centuries are very recent. They only start, actually, interestingly enough, Matt and Cynthia, you have made more political context and sense than anybody else, except my friend Martin Hutchinson, who would, of course, would fight with you like blazes on a quarter of what you all write and disagree on, and would agree with you fearlessly on the other three quarters. Very interesting, volatile, interaction there. but you should keep on top of his stuff. The massive repressive actions that allow people to be hanged for simply stealing a sheep or poaching a lamb do not come from the Dark Ages in England, do not come from even the Tudor repressive tyrants, or certainly not from Cromwell. They come from the Whig liberal domination of England that also holds back the Industrial Revolution in England for 50 years, from 1720 to 1770. And my friend Martin Hutchinson is writing a book on the origins of the Industrial Revolution, which already documents it very strikingly. Not only do they hold back the Industrial Revolution in other countries, they hold it back in their own. Now, in Russia, it is Tsar Alexander II who brings industrialization to Russia. He does more. He banishes corporal punishment and the use of physical brutality in every school in Russia, and he enforces this in the 1850s and 1860s. I want you to sit on, all of you to sit on that. It is contrary to everything we are conditioned to think about the Tsars. It is contrary to everything we are conditioned to think about Alexander. It is contrary to everything we are conditioned to think about the Russian state and Russian society. It is supposed to be endlessly ruthless, endlessly brutal. And at its worst and its excesses, indeed, could be and was, but not always by any means. He also ends all discrimination against Jews in Russia. The Jewish rabbis hate him for this, because he's doing what the best kind of liberalism and emancipation had already done in America and Germany and France. He is freeing the Jews from the medieval Dark Age ghettos of their most obscurantist and darkest rabbis. And therefore, most professional Jews in Russia revere the Tsar to the day he dies. Just as Tsar Alexander II to the Jews of Russia, again, another myth, that Alexander III fell for this because the reactions fed him on it. There was a Jewish girl who was involved in the Rotnaya, only one and not even central to it, but therefore the Jews must be behind the whole thing. Actually, it's Alexander III, being the brutal idiot he was in some respects, and certainly Nikolai II, who really did believe in the blood libel, who drove later generations of Jews into the revolutionary movement. But in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, every professional Jew in Russia, in other words, everyone who had been able to enter the middle class from a background of inconceivable poverty and superstition and suffering, reveres the Tsar as their liberator. He is their Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I have friends still alive in their 90s, I'm glad to say, all too few, alas. One of them, the best of them, just died last week, who marched in FDR's inaugural in 1933, who revere him to this day. My Ukrainian mother-in-law, at age 95, she voted for Hillary Clinton for president of the United States. Why? Because Hillary was the head of the Democratic Party, and it was the Democratic Party under Franklin Roosevelt that saved my mother-in-law and her family and her husband's family from starving to death during the Great Depression. And they revered simply because, of course, Hillary is not an FDR. We know that. She's an anti-FDR. But you see the strength of personal impact and the sense of loyalties, positive loyalties as well as negative ones, that come from these people. We go back to Kropotkin, where it backfires, and why did it backfire? I have a dark suggestion for this. I have not been able to find any evidence for this. Homosexuality was in Russia, everything in Russia is like Ireland. It's anomalous. It's not what it appears to be. Repressive Russia, in many respects, never was so. Homosexuality was legally condemned by the church and the Russian state under Tsar Alexei in the 17th century and under his son Tsar Peter. But it's not in, Russia is a very disorganized feudal society and is a relatively tolerant society. And homophobia really only comes in scattered forms later. Here we need to look at, or I put aside for you to look, and I would be very happy to have anyone in this wonderfully talented, small but very elite and talented group, which you all are. The death of the great composer Tchaikovsky, who is a cousin of the revolutionary Tchaikovsky of the Tchaikovsky circle. That was very important. There are two different Tchaikovskys. But our Tchaikovsky was openly gay. And the story in Petersburg society is that he was forced to commit suicide to hide the scandal of his being gay. But as is so often the case in these cases, with attempts to demonize the Russian royal family and Russian society in general, reality and common sense both fly in the face of the simplistic nostrum. Because Alexander II's son, the Grand Duke, grandson, the Grand Duke Sergei, the son of Alexander II, is openly gay all his life and protects gay people and has a dazzling gay society around him in St. Petersburg. I asked the question, did Alexander II or someone close to him have a gay relationship with the extremely handsome young Peter Kropotkin? Now, Kropotkin is we have the record of, he doesn't look like it. He is a figure who goes through three different stages. As a boy, he appears to be an innocent angel. As soon as he can assert himself as a young man, he grows a pointed goatee beard, he has a dark complexion, and his favorite code name for himself in the anarchist movement is Mephistopheles, the devil. That is his own code name for himself as operational head of the Anarchist International for more than 25 years. Now, you'll remember last week, I pointed out another important, huge theme here, which is how the fiction of truth is necessary to supplant, the truth of fiction is necessary to supplant the lies that are implanted in us by supposed truth in history that is actually a bunch of lies. And I recommended a brilliant book by Dame Rebecca West, the embattled and hate-filled, to her great credit, ex-lover of Herbert George Wells, of H.G. Wells, The Birds Fall Down. I now want to give you a second book, which I should have cited to you last week. And right now it's timely because some of you may be familiar. There is a very nicely done, though rather stolid and too gloomy, television adaptation of a series of detective novels set in Fantasy Vienna 120 years ago. A young disciple of Sigmund Freud, Jewish, of course, Dr. Max Lieberman, and a worthy police officer, Inspector Oskar Liebknecht of the Imperial Vienna Security Office, joined together to solve sensational and corrupt murders in Vienna 120 years ago. And it's very nicely and extremely well done, beautifully acted. The novels are even better. They have a lightness to them, a warmth, and a brilliant wit and scholarship. They are written by Frank Tallis, Tallis. They're all available in paperback. You should start with the last one first, because there is the best portrait of Kropotkin in a fictional form that I had ever seen as the villain of the novel. But like the best of his fine historical novelists, Tallis, who is an English Jewish detective fiction writer, an eminent practicing psychiatrist himself, a very talented, multifaceted Renaissance man, has done his homework. And he has a bibliography in all of his books. Hold on a moment. No, the wrong one. Hold on. Yeah, Twilight. Here we are. There we are, Mephisto Waltz. Now, I'm not sure if it will be, he always has a note on history and sources. And the best book I can come across that he actually mentions here is The World That Never Was, a true story of dreamers, schemers, anarchists, and secret agents by Alex Butterworth, a compelling history of radical politics in the late 19th and early 20th century. You might want to start there, but do not finish there. As I say, what does Kropotkin do? He is a page of the Tsar. Something radical, very radical happens in his life. And I suspect he was raped and sexually abused as a teenage boy, possibly by the Tsar himself, or certainly by someone who the Tsar does not punish for this. And throughout his later life, he has a pattern of extreme, what's the word? He plays around compulsively. He has extreme promiscuity. He is very much a ladies' man, and one can even doff one, as a male chauvinist, one can doff one's hat, I say nervously to that. But there is more to it. There is a sense of overcompensation. And I have had friends in my life who, unlike, I thank God was not exposed to this, growing up in 17th century society, pre-Cromwellian society in Northern Ireland, which it intellectually and emotionally was. There are plenty of other things to screw you up. But people who went to English public schools often were. Boys were buggered by other boys or by teachers. And even through to the 1950s and 60s, before a more open society came, this was common. And I believe, the work, Matt, you have done in documenting the abuse of Native American children from Native American backgrounds in repressive schools in Canada. This was replicated in other parts of the British Empire. And the great psychiatrist, leading expert on child abuse, Alice Miller, the great Swiss psychiatrist, points out that this kind of behavior is frighteningly and disgustingly and horrifically common through human history. And what enables it to continue and survive? The fact that to normal people, as people who have not been exposed to this when they were young, it is so inconceivable that we cannot imagine anyone doing it, let alone that it might be relatively widespread. And therefore, whenever you see this in Freud's own work, Freud comes up with the Oedipus complex because he does try to be an honest, serious scientist. But the amount of, he is a 19th century conventional gentleman. He had how many kids did he have? At least 6, if not more, himself, and a girlfriend on the side as well, at least one. So he's very much a conventional Victorian era, or we would say Kaiser Franz Josef era in his case, paterfamilias. He documents all these cases of people claiming all this horrific sexual abuse, and he cannot believe it is actually happening on such an enormous scale. So he comes up with the Oedipus complex theory to explain it. He's not being deliberately repressive. He's being a 19th century man who goes much further to his credit than anybody else goes. But because of his own background and the inevitable limitations we all have, he's incapable of recognizing what to us is staring him in the face. And I suggest we have to look to Kropotkin too, because as I hope to also discuss, it's a different mechanism, but with George Orwell, we will see his experience, not in Spain, but a decade before as a secret police officer of repression in the British Empire in Burma, makes him a torturer. And as a genuinely decent human being, he is disgusted and horrified, not just by what he did, but by what he found he enjoyed doing. Orwell, like Joseph Conrad, looks into the heart of darkness in the British Empire. And like Conrad, and like Roger Casement, is appalled by what he sees and recognizes there. And so is Kropotkin. But where men like Casement, Conrad, others, rise from this background, Orwell react against it to be exceptionally ethical, fearless, admirable, heroic human beings. The parallels with them, to my mind, with Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King should be obvious. By contrast, Kropotkin goes into his own twisted version of darkness. He becomes a revolutionary. in those heady years of the 1860s, he is heavily influenced by the Nechaev's Revolutionary Testament. He is open about this. He is deeply involved in the fiery Tchaikovsky circle, Nikolai Tchaikovsky circle, which brings him to Sofia Perovskaya. Now, in all the conventional histories, it's written that she's a beautiful, brilliant girl. Two lies. And just look at the picture. Again, I come back to this again and again. I've always seen myself as an anti-intellectual intellectual. Obviously, I'm an intellectual. I flourish and have all my life. My school sent me to Oxford when I was 19 years old. And I was happy there, flourished there. But I came from an industrial city. And my father did not have a university education. A brilliant man, but in very direct ways. Can you imagine a Jewish businessman who was a successful Jewish businessman who adored his son and was not an intellectual, but his favorite reading all his life was American True Detective magazines. And his closest friends were senior police officers. He had a thick Southern Irish accent, and yet his closest friend was a successful officer. He became the deputy head of the Northern Irish Police. You could probably make a comic detective series about it, you know? But the detective series would be false because it would make them sweet and lovable in ways that they would not have wanted to be seen as sweet and lovable. But what my father really wanted to be was a policeman, a police officer, a detective. He loved solving crimes. Or studying from the point of view not of the criminal, but of the cops. When I was a young boy, I thought it was perfectly normal and routine that my dad was able to bring me down on a Saturday night when I was too young yet to go out and check one for girls and at discotheques and get drunk. But before that, no worry. My dad would take me to police headquarters, to the command center, and they would let me in there and watch, you know, all the usual mayhem and drunkenness and knife fights and violence of a typical civilized Saturday night in Belfast City, right? And I grew up this way. I grew up with that, and I thought it was normal. I thought it was normal. But what people lack is, a friend of mine died this past week, a wonderful man called David Richmond. He was a pioneer atomic chemist in the 1950s, who was one of the pioneers of developing harmless radioisotopes that you put through people's bloodstreams to trace the course of diseases and to see how circulation systems and other systems in the body are working. His work has probably saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives by now. And he lived a very long life. He was just short of 90, I think, when he died. But he was a great scientist, a great experimenter. And he was fond of saying to me, science advances by eternally questioning its previous verities, its previous conventionalities, and history is the same. We cannot advance unless we critically question the prevailing wisdoms that were taught to us. And sometimes they will hold up. But an amazing number of times they will not. So here is Kropotkin. Kropotkin is and Sofia Perovskaya. The two conventional wisdoms of Perovskaya, which have been endlessly repeated for 140 years, are she came from a middle-class background, which she did, that's correct. But she was brilliant, intellectually brilliant, and she was beautiful. She was beautiful. Oh, the evil Tsarist regime for hanging a beautiful, idealistic girl. Well, first of all, she wasn't beautiful. Actually, she was very plain and quite ugly, which was something she shared with Emma Goldman, which made them suckers, of course, to be manipulated by Peter Kropotkin, who was extremely sexually experienced when they were not, and who was handsome and dashing and an aristocrat to boot. And they both came from the most obscure backgrounds by contrast. Never underestimate the importance of snobbery in human history, especially if, like I think virtually everyone in this room, which is why you're here, none of you are intellectual snobs. And therefore you are blind to the power of it among all those people who are. I've seen this repeatedly in Washington over the past 36 to nearly 40 years now. People who are bright, people who you think are alert and are just routinely, decently, social democratic, and you think have values, as long as Paul Wolfowitz will smile at them, they will go along with murder and torture in Central America or in Iraq or in Afghanistan or anywhere else. They will sell what is left of their soul for a smile from Paul Wolfowitz. That is the power of intellectual snobbery among people who are not bright and therefore associate with people who are phonies themselves, but are able to pass them off as brilliant. I gave you a quote last week from Emma Goldman on Kropotkin. I know I can look it up, but it will cut my flow a little, so I'll, paraphrase it now. But you'll see it in one of my Strategic Culture articles on the one on the assassination of President McKinley. She writes, "We were in awe of Peter. He was our guiding light, our star, because he was a scientist of genius, and he took the most profound scientific, philosophical ideas." Now, of course, what did Emma Goldman know of philosophy? Nothing whatsoever. She knew enough how to snap a bullwhip at a former boyfriend of hers who was having an affair with an attractive girl half her age. That's as far as philosophy brought her. But she wanted to think of herself as being brilliant. She wanted to think of herself as being an intellectual. I think you, Matt and Cynthia, especially because you're young, especially, you must both have been on the receiving end of this. It's bad enough that you're brighter than most of the people you will have dealt with professionally. But what they hate you most of all for is being younger than they are, while also being far more intellectual and brilliant and knowledgeable than they are. The power of jealousy is so great that the 10th commandment is, "Thou shalt not be jealous, thou shalt not covet," in the book of Exodus, in the Bible. The jealousy of the Pharisee priests for Jesus, because he could perform all these healings and miracles and they could not, is very clearly understood by the gospel writers. This is not an anti-Jewish thing. It's not an anti-English thing. It's a universal theme of human nature, and Kropotkin can play on it. Kropotkin goes too far. He's thrown into the Peter and Paul fortress in Russia in 1875, 1876. This is yet another of the many lies about Kropotkin, that he suffered terribly there. In fact, and we already see this in the way Nikolai I, supposedly the most fearsome and repressive of Tsars, was actually simultaneously a protector and admirer of Alexander Pushkin himself. And how even Stalin was a great admirer of Mikhail Bulgakov and other great figures in Russian literature, which he, and of Shostakovich himself, who he protects. And Shostakovich's music is actually by far the better because of the musical criticism that Stalin personally made of it. What makes Stalin terrifying is that he, to my mind, yes, he is a psychotic mass murderer, but he really is a genius. He really is brilliant. He really does have intellectual power. He really does. And again, I recommend to you two wonderful works on Stalin of extraordinary scholarship by my friend Simon Sebag Montefiore, The Young Stalin and In the Court of the Red Tsar. The Young Stalin and In the Court of the Red Tsar. I had studied Stalin, as I said last week, all my life, and I felt when I read Simon's books, I was only learning to understand him for the first time. We may come back to elements of this later. In Kropotkin's case, Kropotkin goes through radical change. He disappears from Russian society when he is still only in his 20s. He travels to the United States while only in his 20s. He speaks English fluently. He's a genius in his own way. He's not an intellectual genius with new ideas as he imagines he is, but he has great intellectual power and charm, and he can grasp ideas. He gets picks up a life-defining implement, a tool that is the essence of his being, that is his most treasured possession in life for the next 50 years, when he is traveling in the 1860s around America on a scientific botanical expedition as a personal assistant to a leading figure in the Russian Academy of Sciences. What is the life-defining implement or tool that Kropotkin buys in America and appreciates so much that even in his 70s, he proudly shows it off to Emma Goldman in Moscow and Petersburg. It's a state-of-the-art Colt revolver. State-of-the-art Colt revolver. I want you to think about that and not to forget it. We see a similar pattern when we look at the personal lives of the Showa Emperor of Japan, Hirohito. In 1919 and 1920, 21, he visits Europe, he visits England, he visits France. In France, he disrupts his personal schedule and causes no end of panic to the imperial household ministers, because he stays not for 15 minutes, but for the whole afternoon at the tomb of Napoleon. When he goes back to Japan, he has two personal purchases he made for himself that he keeps on his desk in the imperial study in Tokyo, in the imperial palace, till the end of his life. One is a bust of Napoleon Bonaparte, the great conqueror, and the other is a bust of Charles Darwin. Right in the week before Douglas MacArthur lands as the American proconsul in Japan in 1945, Hirohito adds a third bust to his study, which he keeps also, but he knows, of course, it will impress MacArthur. It's a bust of Abraham Lincoln. And David Bergamini, the outstanding biographer in any language of Hirohito, says these three busts are the themes of Hirohito's, the Showa Emperor's life. Conquer, evolve, learn to change belatedly, and at least pay lip service to democracy, which does come back to Japan. It had been developing in and after the time of the Meiji Emperor up to the assassinations in the 1930s. Since this subject is so unknown throughout the West, I might suggest to you having me do a future lecture on Bergamini's great work and on the history of Japan from the Meiji Restoration in, I think, 1868 up to the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Because this is a totally unknown subject in the West, and endless shit, ignorant shit is written on it. And we can do better. We can do, all of us, we have done better, and we will. Now, Kropotkin, as I say, learns the world, or so he imagines, and this is very dangerous, because again, this is a brilliant young man, but there is a phrase that one of the Greek authors uses about Critias, the tyrant of Athens, after the conquest by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. And that is, what makes a man a human being? What makes a man civilized? It is custom, it is convention, it is morality, it is society and ties. But Critias has broken free of all these traditional constraints and is now running wild on the hilltops with nothing to restrain or guide him. And the great English 20th century historian Paul Johnson, who only recently died, extraordinary polymath of a man. I disagree with him in many of his conclusions, but his work is just, on so many issues, oh, wonderful. He talks about 1941 and how the crucial issues of war and peace that affect billions of human beings, lead to the most destructive war in history, are carried out because of the pure wills of two individual human beings, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. And we find this, again, it's a theme we come again and again to. We see it in Grant, we see it in Lincoln. It's one of your philosophical, rightly, I believe, Matt, crucially so, guiding points. Like you and Cynthia have broken free of 120 years of leftist liberal conditioning in the West, that the individual does not matter and cannot matter. The opposite is the case. It is precisely because most people do not care that the handful of people who do care have disproportional power for good and evil in the world. And we see this in Kropotkin's case. He is never a democratic figure. He can never sway millions or hundreds of millions of people like Abraham Lincoln, or for that matter, Disraeli, or for that matter, that idiot Gladstone, who was certainly a crowd pleaser in his own day. But just by able to motivate tiny handfuls of people, and with the power that he sweet talks the British state into giving him. Kropotkin can do this. He's put in this prison, and it's really a luxury boarding house. And when he wants to, he walks out of the feared St. Peter and Paul jail. And the myth, of course, is that he is tortured, that he has been subject to the most repressive and horrific Tsarist persecution. There is no evidence for any of this whatsoever. But he's learned his lesson. He is going to destroy the Russian monarchy, but he is not going to risk being arrested anymore. He's going to be outside Russia. He starts off in Switzerland, which in the canton of Geneva, which, as Lenin found still 40 years later up to World War I, was so decentralized and idealistic and chaotic that a major part of their urban economy was actually having relatively wealthy radical intellectuals from the rest of Europe coming in there with money from their families and supporters. And they were a key factor in supporting the cafes and servants and personal support staffs in Geneva. If you were a radical revolutionary, you didn't flee to Cuba in those days, you fled to Geneva. You fled to Geneva. And later on, Lenin does this, and Kropotkin does this. And later, when even Geneva becomes too hot to handle him, he flees to France, and the French arrest him a bit, but they only go through the half motions of it. The French are being quite ambiguous, because although the French have a soft revolutionary society under the pays lip service of the revolution, while actually being bourgeois repressive under the Third Republic. And they don't want disruption in France particularly. But it's in their DNA from the revolution in the 1890s. And they're still reacting against Napoleon III, which means they're suckers to let the anarchists operate there, which leads to the murder of President Sadi Carnell in 1894, which I know you are well familiar with. But from there, in the late 1870s, the end of the 1870s, around the time of the assassination of the Tsar, Kropotkin ends up in England. And as we see, within 4 months of the assassination of the Tsar, he is established in England. He runs the first anarchist conference. And he is not driven out of England, never to return. He stays in England with impunity for the next 36 years until the Russian Revolution. And Emma Goldman, who becomes his chief lieutenant in America, when the Americans finally get round in their usual well-meaning but incredibly chaotic and belated way to kicking her out forever in 1919. And of course, they get it wrong too. They think she's a communist and she actually hates Lenin, but not for admirable reasons. It's just because Lenin murders people in a different, actually far more industrial scale way than she does, right? But he doesn't do it her way. And where does she go? Who takes her in? It's all your fault, guys. It's Canada's fault. She goes to Montreal and she lives in peace there, protected by the British Empire, until she dies in 1940 at the age of 71 in her own bed. We shall get to her in a few moments. Now, I already last week went into the actual horrific details of the murder of the Tsar, but there are several points to go here. As I pointed out last week, the Tsar was hunted. There were more than half a dozen attempts on his life, serious attempts, more often, more serious, more close to each other and with greater intensity than any Tsar before him or after him. And the Tsar knew he was a marked man and was being hunted. The Okhrana, the dreaded Tsarist secret police, are totally incompetent at this. They seem to be able to fail to raise a finger to catch a single member of the Narodnaya Volya, and there are no more than 50 of them in St. Petersburg, high profile. They're not anonymous peasants. There isn't an anonymous peasant among them. Not one. And there are serious revolutionaries among them, including Perovskaya, who had been in the Tchaikovsky circle. And it was, of course, standard operational procedure for idealistic revolutionaries in the 1860s as well as the 1960s. And one would like to think now, I'm still an old romantic at heart, that free love was practiced as a principle among them in their youth in the 1860s and 70s. Therefore, the likelihood of intimacy between Kropotkin and Perovskaya is extremely strong. And it would also solve another puzzling problem, because Perovskaya, as I say, is not beautiful. She's she's very plain at best. She does not have a nice personality. She is a hater. And why should she be a hater? She was a doted on daughter of a comfortably middle-class family. Where did the hatred come from? Who taught her the hatred? And she isn't very bright. She knows nothing. She isn't like you, Cynthia. She doesn't master the philosophers or read them for leisure. All she can do is pick up a couple of half-baked anarchist slogans. Yet she becomes a brilliant, apparent tactical head of the most dangerous revolutionary cell in Russia, which carries out 7 assassination attempts at least on the Tsar in 3 years. And she has no previous operational background in a terrorism, subversion, underground activity. Where does she learn it, and who does she learn it from? The answer is obvious, because the anarchist movement is a very tightly run movement. I went into this last week. It cannot be emphasized enough. Joseph Conrad understands this in The Secret Agent, and you'll find that in his research, Frank Tallis understands this in his fictionalist account of the anarchist movement, because he has read accounts from the records of the Austro-Hungarian police forces and the police forces of Germany and the United States. In 1898, major police forces in the United States try and warn President McKinley and his personal staff that the president is at risk from the same assassination group that murdered the Empress Elizabeth of Austria in 1898. If anarchism is anarchic, as it claims to be, if it is disorganized and democratic and free will, if it is just these individuals who fall in love with the beautiful, pure ideas of Kropotkin and they have an allure today, that idiot Noam Chomsky reveres Kropotkin to this day. He openly sings his praises endlessly. You will always find useless idiots everywhere. But what is the reality of Kropotkin? He murders people. He murders innocent people. The 3 most suffering societies in the world in the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, have systems of repression that last 30, 40, 50 years. The system of the Empress Suji, the Dowager Empress, in China, she goes through different eras and stages in her society. She does bring in Western investments, but if you are a democratic, a figure of genuine democratic reform, like Sun Yat-sen and many others, you are ultimately forced to leave China for your life, and you will live in danger of your life, and many of those who stay there will be hideously tortured. But at least there is development going on in China amid all the chaos after the repression, the hideous repression of the Taiping. The 2 most horrific societies in the world, Russia and the Ottoman Empire? No, neither of them. Mexico, under Porfirio Diaz, the Stalin of Mexico, the Hitler of Mexico, for 35 years, a man who slaughtered 600,000 people, not in the course of his 35-year reign, but in a single year of repression in 1890. And who gets there following the convenient death by heart attack, which has never been investigated, of the genuinely admirable native mestizo Indian president in 1872. Porfirio Diaz, the Porfirioista, as they call it in Mexico, and I apologize for garbling the language to anyone who genuinely knows the history and culture and traditions of Mexico. As I mentioned before, the average in 1901, even under the worst eras of American industrialism, when Teddy Roosevelt takes over, the average life expectancy of any American, of every American in the United States is 46. But in Mexico, it has dropped to 30 as a direct result, and it was higher than that in the United States in the 1860s, as a direct result of that repression. And that repression is funded by the bankers of New York City and most of all the City of London and Paris. And what is the other most darkest society in the world of that time? Why the modern Democratic of Congo, which is the Belgian Congo of that time, because King Leopold is a psychopath and he murders 10 million people and cuts the hands and toes and feet of hundreds of thousands more from 1885 to 1908. And it is the great Irish humanitarian Roger Casement who plays the central role, actually working at the time for the British Foreign Office of all things, in exposing it to the world. Exposing it to the world. And of course, the British city of London makes enormous profits from this too. And as I've said before often, England only goes to war with Germany in 1914 and loses 1.5 million dead, another 500,000 or so from Canada and Australia and New Zealand, to protect gallant little Belgium, which has just been carrying out until 6 years before the largest recorded genocide in human history, larger in numbers than the Nazi extermination of the Jewish people, and comparable in numbers to the starvation famine of the Ukrainian people by the communists from 1929 to 1932. But you can, once you have the Daily Mail to brainwash your public, you can spin them on a dime. You can spin them on a dime, and it is done. Kropotkin, you see, never makes a serious effort to any effort to kill the worst tyrants in the world. He makes no attempt to kill the president of Mexico or the king of Belgium, even though they are known to be monsters and psychopaths. Who does he kill? Well, Matt and Cynthia, you have done the pioneering work on this, and Anton, of course, too. We all know who he kills, don't we? He kills people who create industrialization and raise the standard of living of their peoples. He kills the King of Italy, the Prime Minister of Spain, the President of France, the President of Russia, and at least one, probably two presidents of the United States. Let us get to the second one now, the murder of President McKinley. And again, this is something I was not looking for. I was curious. I had already done my key work for Strategic Culture Foundation, and as you will well remember, Matt, Cynthia, I had corresponded profitably with both of you and read with great eagerness your work and Anton's work on the 1901 coup, which changed the direction of the United States. And even then, I did not expect what I found. I did not have to look for it. It was staring me in the face. Peter Kropotkin visits the United States twice in his later years. It's well documented. There is a little book that you can find online called Kropotkin in America. Very naive, but very fine scholarship, very densely written. You have to wade through it slowly, but you will find so much there that it's fascinating when you have an honest man doing documentary, and he loves Kropotkin. He's naive about him. He doesn't realize what he's documenting. Kropotkin openly visits the United States twice. It is the British Empire and establishment on both occasions that empower him to do so. He goes there as an internationally respected scientist and as a member of the Royal Society in London, which was founded by Isaac Newton and his friends. An interesting continuity, 230, 240 years before. Now, when he is in Harvard, in Cambridge, he lectures at Harvard University. The most dangerous revolutionary in the world, a man who was already masterminding the murder of Tsar Alexander, comes to the United States and plots and organizes the successful assassination of the President of the United States. And while doing so, he gives a lecture at Harvard in science, which he is a crackpot idiot on and no one questions him on it. And he stays very comfortably as a guest when he's at Harvard. He stays at the Colonial Club, which is one of the most elite places for the Boston Brahmin establishment in Harvard. And who gets him in there? Why, the Colonial Club's most eminent and powerful and respected and influential member at the time, a senator of the United States, Henry Cabot Lodge, who was also the best friend and political guide to future President Theodore Roosevelt, and a major figure in the Republican Party. And also an obsessive racist who was obsessed with the United States joining Britain to create a pure white Anglo-Saxon Protestant global hegemony forever and suppressing the inferior races. Actually, if you're Jewish or Italian or Chinese, it's not so bad. What they're really after is enslaving the, well, actually, Chinese it is bad. There's only one master race in Asia for them, of course. That is Imperial Japan. And they want to exterminate the Native American peoples and their memories, because there is an extraordinary culture going back 4,000 years, unbroken in the Americas. And the Smithsonian Institution, run by a personal, is run for 30 years through the 20th century by a personal nominee of both Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge. And it specializes in not just repressing, but systematically destroying all the archaeological and historical records and memories of the Native American nations through the 20th century. I've written a chapter on this in my unpublished book, and if any of you wants to follow up with me on it, I'll send you the relevant section on it. On that. Now, what I found when I looked at the McKinney assassination, and I've been going on far too long here, so I can tie this up close at last. You've been very patient. But the same methodology of murder that we saw in the successful assassination of the Tsar is exactly replicated in the assassination of President McKinley, stage by stage. First, Kropotkin has sussed out the ground personally. He has been there. He had been in St. Petersburg. He had been in the anarchist circle, the Tchaikovsky circle. It was there that he met and used his first catspaw, Sofia Andreevna, who was later hanged by the Tsar, and rightly so. She is the woman who, after the first assassination attempt on Tsar Alexander failed, and Tsar Alexander gets out of his armored carriage to comfort dead and dying and seriously wounded Russian policemen and soldiers who have been injured in the first and killed in the first bomb attack. She is the young woman only 50 to 100 yards away who raises her hand in the air as the signal to Grabotsky, or Heranovich, if you want to use his Polish name, the illiterate Polish recruit who has been recruited to throw the second lethal shrapnel bomb personally designed to eviscerate the Tsar. And it does so. And even in her trial, as I've said before, investigators are puzzled by her hatred for the Tsar and her own fellow conspirators, who, idiots though they are, think they are idealists. They think they're there to develop a beautiful, wonderful society. Anyone here ever seen that wonderful musical version of Les Miserables? There's a wonderful scene in it where the hero is lamenting all his friends who have died on the barricades, totally fruitlessly and needlessly, in an utterly unnecessary and false revolution, when incidentally the French monarchy was liberalizing anyway in 1830. And he laments, my friends, my friends. All you could see was the beautiful future ahead of you. All you could see was a future that never came. That is what most of the assassination circle around Perovskaya in the Anarchist International, they're dupes. That's what they see. The night after the murder, they all gather. They don't even think to run in different directions. They're twits, they're idiots. Rebecca West understands this in The Birds Fall Down, and she makes fun of them this way. You know, the old Tsarist Minister of Justice saying, you are such idiots. You are depressed because you were sitting in the darkness and going hungry because none of you had the wit to go to a corner shop and simply buy a piece of sausage and buy a candle for light. How did our intelligentsia suddenly start producing absolute idiots and morons? Well, of course, with global warming, they're still doing it to this day on a global scale. Answer is, it's easy. It's easy. But what they do is the night of the murder, the Tsar is not even dead yet. He is screaming in agony with his legs blown off and his abdomen blasted open. And they are celebrating the dawn of a new era of eternal happiness in Russia, which will begin immediately. How can you be so stupid? Well, they drank the Kool-Aid baby. They drank the Kool-Aid. And Kropotkin replicates this system. In 1898 and 1901, he visits Russia. He is the guest of a senator of the United States. He gives public lectures in New York City and Boston. He lectures at Harvard University as an invited guest. And in Chicago, he is a member of the Royal Society. The British establishment gets him over there. There is never any problem with paying the cost for him to travel and stay anywhere he wants in the highest comfort. How did this happen? But he meets other people too. He is very close with Emma Goldman, who is she's rather like Jane Fonda was during the Vietnam War, you know? High profile, always doing the wild, ridiculous things in public. And as long as she gets a headline, she really doesn't care about anything else. She is already notorious for the attempted murder of a lover who two-timed her with another girlfriend who was half her age, who she quite literally attempted to whip to death. Goldman was ugly and stupid, but certainly flamboyant, and she knew how to get a headline. She meets Leon Czolgosz, the murderer of President McKinley, at least twice before the assassination. She meets him, first of all, when he, according to her account, he comes up to her at an anarchist meeting in Cleveland, Ohio, in July 1901, only 2 or 3 months before the assassination, and she gives him a reading list. She claims only a reading list. Later, they meet again, and he visits her where she is staying in Chicago. He goes all the way to Chicago. Now, he's a starving nubnik. He's a nobody. Where can he afford to run around the northeastern United States and visit people like this? And she sees, although he's supposedly a nobody, she bothers seeing him on both occasions. There is a strong presumption of US law enforcement officers at the time and thereafter that she supplied him with the gun with which he fatally shot the president. But where did he shoot the president? In Buffalo, now, because the president was going to attend the World's Fair. Now, World's Fair were held every 2 or 3 years around the world, and Americans had a particular fetish for them from the 1870s all the way through to the 1930s and 40s. But they're usually held in big booming cities, or cities that appear, at least at the moment, to be the city of the future. And American society is so wonderfully volatile and unpredictable, which is one of its greatest strengths and adaptations, of course, that what appeared to be the city of the future yesterday, you know, will be remotely blasé tomorrow. There are world fairs held in St. Louis. There are world fairs held in St. Louis. There are world fairs held in Seattle. There are world fairs held in LA. There are world fairs held all over the place. But Buffalo was a very unusual place to hold one even in 1901. It is extremely remote. When you say Buffalo, New York, everybody thinks, oh, it must be right beside New York City. No, New York State is huge and tends to be conservative and very empty, and not even good farmland. It has an Ulster County, after my native Northern Ireland, named for a reason, because the land is not remotely as good as most of the land you have up there in Ontario or in Quebec. It's poor land. You have to travel 400 miles indirectly by rail in 1901 to get to Buffalo. It is in the back end of nowhere, right? So why hold a World's Fair there? But Buffalo did have a distinction. Since 1870, it had been one of the main colonies or centers of revolutionary anarchism in the United States of America. And plotting the assassination of a president in Buffalo, as opposed to New York or Washington or Boston or Philadelphia, or Chicago, has enormous advantages because there is no federal police force yet. There is no FBI. There is no Bureau of Investigation, as it will be when Teddy Roosevelt sets it up as a police force of national repression, which again, Kropotkin was too stupid to foresee because Roosevelt and his friends had their own agenda. And it was not an admirable one. It was a different one. But the police forces in New York and Chicago and Washington and Philadelphia and Boston are sophisticated, large, experienced police forces with anti-terrorism units in them and large cadres of experienced detectives. And Buffalo is a hick industrial town, and it doesn't have any of that experience. And its anarchist sale is therefore led with impunity by the most violent revolutionary anarchist in America, a guy who even gave Emma Goldman trouble and headaches. His name is Johann Most, M-O-S-T, originally of German background. So we again, everything is put back to front. When we look at the assassination of President McKinley, the thought is, oh, that idealistic but tragically misled individual, pure little anarchist went out of his way to the World's Fair to kill President McKinley. No, the World's Fair is especially set up in Buffalo so that the anarchist organization in Buffalo, free from being harassed and monitored by a competent police force with a major intelligence surveillance section, is free to direct him and operationalize, plan, and execute the assassination of the president with total immunity. Everything is back to front. We see the same thing in 1963. President Kennedy is brought to a city where the police force is totally infiltrated and run by anti-Black racists, and most of all by the organized crime syndicate in Dallas, so that the assassination can be carried out there under the protection of the police, not in spite of it. And of course, it's a second attempt against President Kennedy, because only a few weeks before, and there is a wonderful book about this simply called The Unthinkable by a great, great scholar. If you just look up his name, if you need me to look it up, it'll take me about 2 minutes away from the screen later to do so. So remind me to do so if you need to. But I mentioned this before. There was an attempt which was foiled by a CIA honorable double agent who had the code name Lee, who was almost certainly Lee Harvey Oswald, who the plot was for President Kennedy to be killed from an overpass while visiting the city of Chicago, where Mayor Richard Daley hated him, where again, the assassins could be safely protected in order to carry out the assassination. And when that didn't work, President Kennedy is shunted for supposedly political reasons to visit Dallas as well. And we see the same incidents with President McKinley. It is not that the assassin does it on the spot or takes advantage of the rare chance of having the president there or doesn't think of it before. The president is moved out of his bubble of safety to begin with to a place where he will be vulnerable, where the assassination can be plotted and prepared and executed and carried out, and the killers can get away with impunity under the protection of the politically controlled local police. This is the assassination pattern with President Kennedy, and it is the same identical pattern with President McKinley. But we also see, as we have seen, the replication of the 1881 pattern of assassination. Peter Kropotkin liked to work through two levels of people. He liked to have a mistress of his who revered him as a genius, who would carry out every one of his operational plans, and Sophia Andreevna, who is the only revolutionary ever to succeed in assassinating a Tsar of Russia, who is not a member of the household. There are many assassinations of presidents, of Tsars in the 19th century up to 1801, but they're all plots within the family which implicate household guards. None of them are revolutionary cells seeking to topple Tsardom. They're just seeking to change policy by getting their own king, emperor, or empress in power instead. This happens repeatedly in 19th century Russia under the heirs of Peter the Great, until the death of Tsar Paul and the mourning for his father, motivated to a great degree by guilt by Tsar Alexander I, who later beat Napoleon, breaks the pattern. It breaks the pattern. And from then to the end of Tsardom, Tsars do have close, loving, warm relationships with their Tsareviches, with their sons, with their heirs, continually. But the pattern before that is a very different one. But it's not a revolutionary pattern. The only revolutionary leader who succeeds in killing a Tsar is an idiot with no operational background or experience whatsoever. How does she do it? Because she is not the leader. She is told what to do and how to do it. And we see the same pattern 20 years later with Emma Goldman. And she personally and who do they choose to be the fall guy? The actual murderer, the dirty job, the dirty part of the job. Well, Peter is of the House of Rurik, is he not? He is a Russian prince, is he not? He is a more pure Russian than any mere Romanov Tsar is, isn't he? So of course they use a dirty Polak. The racism of Russians at the time against Poles, and of Poles against Russians back, on both sides, huge. And it hasn't disappeared. My late father-in-law, a dear, revered friend to me from the moment we met to the day he died, was in American terms a liberal Democrat, a fearless figure in the oil industry for protecting African-American and Hispanic friends and fellow engineers in the racially charged years in the 1950s and 60s. Many warm Jewish and Irish friends from his time in the military. But he was ethnic Russian, and his family had spent years back in Poland, where he had been beaten up as a boy repeatedly because he was a dirty Russian in interwar Poland, whose racist rules were later copied carefully by the apartheid regime in South Africa. And for the rest of his life, even when he was on his deathbed, one of his favorite memories he kept sharing with me was beating some poor unfortunate Polish fellow to a pulp in a bar in Jersey City back after World War II, just after he was demobbed. That's how deep this kind of thing goes, even among civilized, decent, admirable people like my father-in-law. And here, what do we find? We find in America, democratic America, it is a Polak who is used by the Russian head of the Anarchist International through a useful lady cut back with intellectual pretensions, though she is the last thing in the world from being intellectually educated or bright herself, but she has false pretensions which are always easy to manipulate and very dangerous. And it is exactly the same template with cutouts and plausible deniability to carry out the assassination. And in both cases, too, the assassination is only possible because of complicity in the deep state. The Okhrana itself appears to have stood back, and 180 years before Colonel Fletcher Prouty wrote about the Kennedy assassination this way, a classic Kennedy-style Prouty analysis assassination takes place in Russia with the Tsar. You have a leader of the state, an all-powerful, immensely popular, widely loved, credible leader, the man who abolished beatings in Russia, the man who abolished capital, not just many forms of capital punishment, but the man who banned all beatings and corporal punishment in every school in Russia, when it was still for the next 90 years routine in every English public school for the English ruling class. I and my then friend, and we differ on many issues since George W. Bush took power, but we were close friends for decades, and I wrote for him in National Review. The old days, John O'Sullivan, who was a senior speechwriter and political advisor to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. John and I were once guests of a very eminent British aristocratic figure at a very agreeable lunch, which we did not have to pay for at the Hay Adams Hotel opposite the White House. This would be about the year 2000 or so. And it was a very agreeable meeting. John was a genius in recognizing that if you feed people the best of wine and drink and food, you will get much better business deals and agreements out of them. They will amazingly, magically become mellow instantaneously. I recommend this to those, especially to Matt, to you and Cynthia, because this is an aspect of diplomacy, business diplomacy, and academic diplomacy, which is always ignored. You either pick it up and you know it, or you don't, but you are amazed how far it will get you. And our host on this occasion, as we were mellowing out over the port and the Stilton cheese, is an English aristocrat. And he says, well, the subject gets onto the reason for the fall of the British Empire. He has a very interesting take on it. Oh, it's very obvious, he says. Boys aren't buggered anymore at public schools. There's no homosexual rape anymore at schools, so it makes them soft. And John and I, who had both gone through grammar school backgrounds, we had not been at boarding schools, and we both, I was already 50, John was 60. We thought of ourselves as men of the world. And I'm spluttering over my current scotch and soda. And I see John is doing the same, because of course, with this fellow, he assumes we're the same kind of, quote, men of the world that he is. And we're not. Tsar Alexander II bans this kind of behavior in every school in Russia and enforces it as long as he lives. No wonder he is regarded as a threat to civilization by the old repressive types. So the murder of the Tsar is allowed to happen. Now, the people and the police forces around President McKinley are not like that. They do not want it to happen. But there are powerful forces in the Republican Party of the United States, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, who do want it to happen. Theodore Roosevelt is governor of New York State, and a very incompetent one. He's one of these people, he's rather like Emma Goldman in his own way. Emma Goldman is today revered as a champion of human rights, of women's rights, of sexual reproduction rights, of birth control. Well, she sounds off about this on occasions, but there is not a single practical measure or even popular demonstration or organization or conference ever that she ever does practically to improve the living standards, the human living conditions, the rights, the reproductive rights, or anything else of women in the United States of America. She is an ex post facto and after the event heroine of women's liberation. She is presumed in retrospect to have been a great figure of liberation, and she was nothing of the sort. Nothing of the sort. Nothing of the sort. An interesting another example of this and how myths are renewed and republished. There, another book to bring to your attention, an execrably bad musical, Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow. The book was a huge New York critical hit and therefore a bestseller in the 1970s. There was a musical made of it, which appeared to do well at first, but once people had actually seen it, word of mouth spread, and it collapsed virtually immediately afterwards. I was fascinated by the period, and I love Broadway musicals when they're well done, and this was not well done. And again, you have to see it so that you know you're not just taking my word for it. You have to see incompetence with your own eyes in order to believe it. It really has to be done that way. And there's one book I will close on more or less here, and I mentioned it before. It's called The Prince of Evolution. It's supposedly an admiring biography of Kropotkin. It manages to go, it is only 80 pages long. It is utterly stupid, and it is by an obscure lecturer at a very obscure polytechnic school or university buried somewhere in the southeast west of England. But it is worth reading for the same reason Barbara Tuchman is worth reading, to see how stupid and naive these people are. At least Tuchman can tell a story. She is convincing. She is readable. The fact that, again, she writes supposed history, and it's fiction. It's all fiction. Whereas in Mephisto Waltz, Frank Tallis has written a novel about the anarchist movement, and he did his homework. He studied police files. He studied serious historical studies of the revolutionary movement that went into criminal files. And the key to understanding the anarchist movement is not to look at it ideologically, but to look on it as a criminal organization and to look at the police research which has been done into it. And I will close here on that. There is much else, of course, one can say, always more. I'm hopefully open to questions as time permits. But a key point here for me personally is a wheel coming full circle. Because as I told you, I am the son of a man who served in Irish intelligence in World War II. And when he came out, actually tried to get a job as a private detective in Belfast and worked as one for 2 or 3 years in the 1940s. But he found it was my dad found it was a good way to starve. So he was a good piano tuner. He went to work for a piano company and in the end raised enough capital to start one. The trade unions didn't let him do, and the tax system didn't let him do very well with that, but he did well from it. He sold out to a huge chain, Great Universal Stores, which was rather like the Walmart of the day in Britain. And he rose up to a corporate level through the management structure. So he had an unusual path in life. But the irony was, here was a successful, middle-class, respectable Jewish businessman, and not an intellectual, but left to himself. He wanted to be a policeman. He wanted to be a detective. And you could not be a respectable middle-class gentleman in Northern Ireland, of all places, even in England, but certainly in remote industrial Belfast in the 1940s and 50s, and be Jewish. It was unheard of. But what I find now is, I am looking at the anarchist movement through my father's eyes and through his friends' eyes. The way to approach the anarchist movement is, as among the great writers, John le Carré would have done it, and the great Joseph Conrad, who was Polish also, by the way, a genius, did it in his classic work, The Secret Agent. The way to do this is not to look at them through the Marxist lens of ideology, which is, as I said last week, the 20th century equivalent of Byzantine and Catholic theology in the Dark and Middle Ages. No, the way to do it is objectively, in the ways they actually operated, which is they were murderers, and very successful murderers. Look at how they murdered, and look at how they repeated patterns of murder. Now, I will close specifically with a question and challenge to you, because this is something I know you, Matt, and you, Cynthia, already know vastly more than I do, and I have not had the chance to look into this thoroughly yet. And that is, between 1881 and 1901, the two great bookends of assassination, and there were more afterwards, but we have many other classic killings in between. What I want to suggest to you is, can the murder of the Tsar be seen as a template for any of these other killings as well? What kind of method was used for the killing? What kind of local anarchist cell supported the killers? Was there plausible deniability? Had Kropotkin spent time personally in the cities and nations where the assassination took place? He visits Buffalo. You see, I keep forgetting key points. In 1898 and 1901, he visits Buffalo on two separate occasions. Buffalo is a minor American industrial city, 400 miles away from New York, even further away from Boston and Chicago. It is in the middle of nowhere. And why does Kropotkin, who is addressing mass meetings in Boston, in New York City and Chicago, why does he bother to go to Buffalo, where the president will be murdered, and which already has the most violent and dangerous anarchist cell in the United States, but because it is a small, out-of-the-way place, does not have a sophisticated police force to monitor those anarchists? I leave you with that. And I think it's a very good place to leave you on it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Martin, for yeah, everybody's really impressed by what you were able to go through there. I wanted to clarify the Dostoyevsky book you were mentioning, that's Demons?
Yes, because of the beauties and deliberate ambiguities of the Russian language, different translations give it different titles. It's called The Demons, it's called The Devils, it's called The Possessed. It's the same book. But I particularly recommend, there was an outstanding new translation of it, came out in recent years, that again, through family and friends, I like to think my sloppiness is inspired. It's really laziness, of course, but I only came across this because my lovely better half picked it up, and I wouldn't have known it was available otherwise. But there's an outstanding new translation of it that came out in recent years that really brings out aspects of Dostoevsky, his raciness, his colloquialness, his mastery of his humor. There is no humor in Tolstoy. There's a very great deal indeed in Solzhenitsyn. And there's a surprising amount in Dostoevsky, usually a dark, twisted humor, because Dostoevsky, like Solzhenitsyn, had been a zek. He'd been a political camp slave and prisoner. So he was, he could see the world from the bottom up.
All right, so we have young Declan, who has put his name in the list. You can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I was just wondering, you talk about all these different assassinations that are done, and all of them have taken multiple tries. But you also say that the protection for the Tsar or the president, whoever it may be, was very poor. And so why did it take so many tries? I was wondering.
The answer is in the case of McKinley. It's a very good question, and there is a good answer for it. Thank you for asking it. Again, we are not looking at this in terms of ideology. We are looking at this the way cops would look at it, or army planners. We are looking at the methodologies and the specifics, you might say the forensics of each individual case. The assassination attempt on the Tsar is a pioneering one. It's the first one that goes right. The group is a very small group. There are only 50 active members in it and only 200 sympathizers in a Russia already of over 100 million people. And they're all in St. Petersburg. And even then, they keep trying and failing. And yet, they are allowed to do so again and again. Yet once the job is done, once the great Tsar is dead, all of a sudden, the Okhrana becomes efficient. And they arrest them all within a week. What does that suggest to you? But you're right, before that, they are amateurs. They are amateurs in 1878 when they make 3 serious attempts in Germany, where you must remember the movement was much more larger and supposedly more powerful and dangerous in Germany. And this was universally believed at the time, precisely because Germany had a massive education system, was a massive education. Therefore, it was assumed lots more people were idealistic. And in fact, when it came to constructive revolution and change and evolution, the German public were not warmongers. They voted for the Social Democratic Party, the direct ancestor of today's ruling Social Democratic Party in Germany, repeatedly in election after election under Kaiser Wilhelm II, which drove him crazy. The German people, to their credit, were overwhelmingly enlightened people in the 19th century and the early 20th century, up to the catastrophe of World War I, when the British starved 750,000 of them, women and children, to death. But there are 3 attempts in Germany which is where you'd expect it to succeed, and they all fail because they haven't got their act together yet. And it takes them 6 more attempts unsuccessfully, maybe 7 or 8, before they can actually pull it off with the Tsar. But once they have succeeded with the Tsar, they can replicate the assassination. They can replicate the methodology. They've succeeded once, they can succeed again. Why do we remember Yuri Gagarin? First man in space. Neil Armstrong, first man on the moon. Excuse me. How many men and women followed Gagarin into space? Plenty. How many followed Neil Armstrong to the moon? Officially, at least. How many? I think a dozen. I think 6 two-man teams from later Apollo flights are documented. Once you've done something for the first time, it becomes easy. The first time is the hardest. When they get to President McKinley, there's only 1 attempt necessary to kill President McKinley, and then they kill him. There had already been, in a different case, the assassination of President Garfield in 1881, but they had plausible deniability in 1881. This is an area where Matt and Cynthia have much more knowledge than I do and may want to come in on this, because the political context is clear in 1881. The motivation for the assassination is clear, but it isn't done by an anarchist. Another useful idiot is found. Now we go to the assassinations in the United States in the 1960s, and once the assassination of President Kennedy is carried out, and poor Levi Harvey Oswald is shot dead protesting his innocence, before people can actually wake up to the fact that he really was an innocent man, then all of a sudden the same pattern is replicated in the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, and of King Faisal of Saudi Arabia in 1975, and in the attempted assassination of Governor George Wallace of Alabama, a white-ring racist, but from that perspective, equally threatening to the liberal imperialist hegemony in the United States in 1972. And you always find a confused idiot stumbling around who you can then safely blame the murder on. And why on earth is Sirhan being just denied a few weeks ago parole after well over half a century for the assassination of Robert Kennedy, when forensic evidence on an audio tape makes quite clear, as well as eyewitness accounts at the time, that he could not have fired the bullets at point blank range into the back of Senator Kennedy's head, because nobody puts him near the back of Senator Kennedy's head or at point blank range with Senator Kennedy. And yet he isn't still allowed access to investigators outside the federal prison system in the United States. But in each case, you see, once you have carried out the first major killing and you've gotten away with it, not only does it empower you to think you can do it again, but you will repeat, or the people responsible will repeat their methodologies. They will repeat and replicate the methodologies. So Declan, your question is an excellent one. Thank you for asking it, because the answer is enormously revealing and important. And again, you saw the anomalies here. And when we address the anomalies, we learn a lot more. By the way, are you back in Ireland or are you in Canada?
I'm actually in Texas.
Oh, the new global world, I'm completely thrown for a loop. Which part of Texas, do I ask?
I'm north of Houston.
Well, I mean, the energy capital of the world, still useful place to be.
Yeah.
Again, thank you. That was a wonderful question.
Thank you, sir.
All right, Bob, you're up.
Marty, thanks for another riveting presentation. I had a question. I actually had several questions, but you covered so much turf that I forgot most of them there. So you mentioned at one point Sigmund Freud's son-in-law, which was Edward Burns, I believe, or Bernays.
Yes, yes.
Edward Bernays. And he was quite a character in his own right, with the being the chief propagandist that evidently, I heard Joseph Goebbels even copied down some of his best ideas. So I just thought I'd mention that because he's like a subject for another, almost another class, you know. The other thing, you seem to be very well interested and versed in historical fiction. Also, you familiar with Edward Rutherford?
Yes, I like his work.
Yeah, that's great stuff. But it's interesting as you did on Ireland and so
Yes.
there's several things on Britain and on Ruski also.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think you've read more of them than I have, but I was very impressed and very much enjoyed it.
Yeah. My wife started reading them, and she said, "I think you might like this," and it's really good stuff and very well researched. I think the historical periods. Anyway, that's all for now.
Thank you, Bob.
We'll look forward to next time.
Did you have something to say, Matt? I thought.
Yeah, I guess I do. There's so many things to say. I mean, Marty, like usual, you just open up so many questions. It's the sign of the best presentation, where you really have so many rich questions and paradoxes that you're throwing out there to open up new vistas to explore. So it's really exciting. I was just thinking to myself, sorry. I was thinking about the Okrana and how they were formed also in 1881 by Count Ignatieff. And I was wondering if you had any insight into into the story of its formation a little bit more, because obviously the Okrana has played it had a very short-lived life as the secret police agency of Russia, but it also played such a nefarious role all the way through the color revolution that was the Bolshevik Revolution in so many levels, and running these different, just terror cells with their operations in France. And I was wondering, do you know anything about like what was this deep state pillar and how was it set up? Like, do you have that story?
I do not have the story, but I have, and in fact, I've had for many years elements of the story, like seeing tentacles writhing on a screen, and they're all apparently separate, but you intuitively feel there must be an octopus controlling all of the different tentacles you see. And in fact, I think this is obvious to small audience, as seminars are, but you're all of such intelligence and commitment and intellectual energy in this. And I throw this out here as a series of suggestions because I think this is something that is crying out to be explored. And I suspect you and Cynthia, Matt, and Anton especially, and others of your friends and colleagues may already have done a lot of work on this. But first of all, I am very familiar with the operational work of the Soviet secret police in the 20th century. And of course, the system renewed itself again as the SVR, the External Intelligence Service, and I forget which other name I always get it mixed up, but they have, again, a separate External Intelligence Service and Domestic Intelligence Service now since 1991, which again has been growing very much again in capability and effectiveness, both domestically and around the world, since President Putin, who had been a senior officer in the KGB itself, and a very able one before that. Incidentally, since these things always come to my mind, it does light things up, and I think it is revealing. When you're looking at President Vladimir Putin, he is certainly not a hater of all things Western, and he is certainly not a man to underestimate either. This is a man who, and I saw this with my own eyes in the early nearly 20 years ago. I don't know if it's still true, but in his early years in the presidency, the presidential car is, the equivalent of what you'd say an Air Force One on wheels. The armored car that they used to transport the president daily, by his choice, the registration number on it is 007, was 007. He's a James Bond fan. The president of Russia, the current president of Russia, is a James Bond fan. Now, you can take anything or nothing from that as you like. It is entertaining. Stalin and Hitler both loved American Western novels, especially written by the German writer Karl May. Stalin, in fact, we know from the testimony of the surviving Politburo, especially loved the Westerns of John Ford and John Wayne. But then Stalin always had genuinely outstanding artistic and intellectual taste. Trotsky's lie that he was the biggest nonentity in the party was, of course, a jealous, sneering comment by a man who was like Kropotkin, Trotsky, an intellectually pretentious jerk himself. Stalin was far smarter, and we know from Stalin's library there are thousands of pages of major works of history and philosophy and economics, both good and bad, but serious, that he writes on, and that he underlines, and that he puts his own comments in. And the pages are curled and torn. They've been read and reread and restudied repeatedly over long periods. This is not a man to underestimate. But back on the basic issue here, just as in the Soviet era, the secret police is like the immortal jellyfish. They found, it's like a study in reincarnation. Every 10 or 20 years, when there was a political upheaval in the Soviet Union, the leadership of the police of the Soviet Secret Service and domestic repressive service were purged. And most of the ordinary working class members of it, not all, there were those unlucky enough to be caught in the court, but by and large, the members remained the same, but some were purged. And the higher up you went, the more thorough the purging was. And this was a repeated pattern every 20 to 30 years through Soviet history. And sometimes it was purged in a liberal direction, and sometimes it was purged in a repressive direction. And the Okhrana does not start in 1881. The Okhrana, as you say, Matt, the organization, very dark organization, the organization of repression, as blessed by Alexander Pobyedonostsev and by Dostoyevsky, and most of all by Tsar Alexander III. It starts in 1881 as a direct reaction to the murder of the Tsar. And a major reason it starts is, I think there is a well-founded suspicion that the Tsar's father should and could have been saved. As I say, it comes back. This is really one of the first deep state assassinations. And again, if we go back to Shakespeare and statescraft, is there something rotten in the state of Denmark? Well, the king of Denmark gets poisoned and murdered. And then afterwards, in the upheaval that happens, another king of Denmark and a queen are both murdered, and other people get violently killed as well. And Shakespeare is fascinated by the murder and death and subversion of kings. On the one hand, it's the worst crime he can possibly imagine. And on the other hand, he's fascinated by it. Henry IV, Henry V, Richard II, Richard III, the cycle of Henry VI, they all revolve around Edward II by Marlowe, supposedly by Marlowe. It's actually the first attempt at tackling this subject in identical prose to the prose Shakespeare later uses, of course. But all of Shakespeare, Marlowe's creative work, above all else, he isn't a political thinker. He cannot solve this as political theory. And this is what makes him a great artist, because he therefore follows the human complexity and tragedy in each case. Now, when we come to Tsarist history, we see the same patterns. There are eras when the organs, as Solzhenitsyn calls them, appear to be in recession far out at sea. And then there are the eras of repression when they come storming back. And then there are the eras that usually come very unexpectedly of thaws in Russian history and creativity that also come. So there is certainly repression in a massive way under Tsar Nikolai I. And incidentally, since you know I inevitably spew out books here, there is everyone I think here will have heard of Alexander de Tocqueville's masterpiece, Democracy in America. A book that understands America better to this day in the 21st century than any American writer in the 21st, political writer in the 21st century does. It's that good. But what is not generally known, and I'd be interested to hear if any of you are already familiar with this.
That was Hofstadter, Democracy in America, was it?
No, that's a great book too, but that's by an American Jewish.
Maybe I'm thinking of somebody else. And yeah,
I'm thinking about the Count, the Marquis de Custine, Custine, who wrote, whose work has been republished as Russia in the time of Tsar Nikolai I. The Marquis de Custine was a liberal idealist figure in 1830s France, a brilliant man, gay, relatively openly so, with enormous intellectual ambitions. And when he saw how Alexis de Tocqueville had become really rightly the most revered and influential and respected political intellectual in the Western world for his work Democracy in America, he determined to do the same thing in Russia. Now, actually, he started out not as a liberal. He started out wrong. It was the opposite. He was a fashionable aristocratic reactionary who thought quite rightly that the French Revolution was a catastrophe that had led to hecatombs of dead. So he goes to Russia and is welcomed there by Tsar Nikolai I and is a personal friend of the Tsar's and even enjoys many personal, intimate conversations with the Tsar. That is Alexander II's father, right? And he publishes on this a great book on Russia, except he has become so horrified by the systematic repression and backwardness, not to mention the hideous weather and cooking of Russia and Petersburg in the 1830s and 1840s, especially once Pushkin is dead, what is there, right? I mean, actually, Herzen and a lot of other, and Dostoyevsky and a lot of other wonderful people are burrowing there beneath the surface, but they don't really break surface till the 1860s. So de Custine comes from there and goes back to France. And although he had been a fashionable reactionary all his life, he is so horrified by what he finds in Russia that it makes him a liberal reformer. Not a revolutionary at all, but a moderate liberal reformer in France for the rest of his life. But his book is fabulous. It is beautiful. It is, in its own way, it is as piercing and wise as de Tocqueville himself, and the two of them are really bookends to each other. They're not contradictions to each other. They are bookends. They complement each other. And in fact, in 1993, I wrote a book predicting, not explaining, called The Last Red Hope, Mikhail Gorbachev and Why Perestroika Failed. I could not get a publisher for it anywhere in Britain or America. It was impossible. And eventually I did get a publisher for it. in a right-wing fascist popular newspaper in Moscow. It was translated into Russian and published there in 1993. It's never been published in English yet. And the reason for this is I was turning Marxist theory on its head. I was showing that all the champions of out of control, unregulated Reagan, Bush II free market capitalism in America were actually imposing false patterns of historical determination on Russia. They were making the same mistakes that Trotskyites made and that Marxists made. And I was actually in my book, 25 years before I met you folks, coming intuitively to one of the basic guiding themes of your lives, the central role of key individuals in policy and intellectual thought in shaping the future destiny of nations and of the human race. Because my point was, Gorbachev didn't have to fail. Had he followed the Chinese model of reform of Deng Xiaoping, which is to put economic reform and improvement first while keeping a strong political structure, because you cannot have democracy and liberalization until there is a sufficiently large, responsible, property middle class, and educated, increasingly comfortable working class to have the responsibility and the maturity to make tolerance and democracy and diversity work. This was not an original idea by me either. The man who came up with it has for the past 20 years been a senior advisor to President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Migranian, that's his name. I'll have to look up his first name, but look up any books by Migranian, M-I-G-R-A-N-I-A-N. He's a genius. I interviewed this guy for the Washington Times in 1989. He predicted then that the Tiananmen Square riots would fail and Chinese economic growth under an authoritarian system would flourish and go on more healthily than ever. Whereas by bringing in too much democracy in the wrong way too soon, Gorbachev was dooming Russia to a Weimar period of great suffering, inflation, and mass suffering in Russia, and everything unveiled exactly as Migranian said. Now, the one thing I'll add here is, what was this man doing at the time? He was the chief ideologist in the Institute for the Study of Socialism in Moscow, right? And when I first visited him, along with the then editor-in-chief of the Washington Times and many other, eminent Washington free market conservatives in the group, the first thing this chief ideologist at the Institute for the Study of Socialism said to us, well, I don't want to mislead you. I want you to understand me properly to begin with, where I'm coming from. I am a great admirer and disciple of Margaret Thatcher. The editor-in-chief of the Washington Times at the time, who's just died, a lifelong, genuinely reactionary conservative, though I had a very good relationship with him for many years, the late Wesley Pruden, turned to me as we were going out and said, Marty, I never before thought all my life I would see the death of communism, but now I know we have. I have just seen the chief ideologist in the chief communist think tank, most influential and powerful communist think tank in Moscow, tell me he is a disciple, openly, he is a disciple of Margaret Thatcher. And I, of course, then said to him, because I admired the man, I wanted to play straight with him. I said, I take it you're saying this off the record. I wouldn't want to embarrass you or put you in any danger or cost you your job or your career. No, he said, I want you to quote me, Mr. Steve, please do. Now, I would be a lot more cautious about many of the things I say privately, not to mention publicly, about President Biden and many of the and Secretary of State Blinken, not to mention Janet Yellen and people around them today, but that's another story.
All right, so we have one more question, if that's not too much for you, Martin.
One of my favorite literary quotes, Cynthia, the madder Hulk gets, the stronger Hulk grows. In my case, the more I talk, the more I want to talk, so bring it on.
All right, so John.
Thanks, Marty, for a good lecture. I was curious, have you ever read James Billington's Fire in the Minds of Men?
Yes, a wonderful, fabulous book. Because again, it brings it to life, what people thought. Not necessarily that they were right, but it brings out what is crucial here, the imaginative impact and emotional impact of ideas on motivating people and what they do and do not do. It's a wonderful book.
Yeah, it's quite great, and it traces the thought roots of what's going on, but you're filling in the actual on the ground political stuff, which is kind of supplements it really well. Thank you.
No, I agree with you, and thank you for bringing it up, Joan. It is most timely here.
All right. So it is getting late, and I don't want to take Martin's time too long, although you've opened up so much that, I mean, so many leads in this that definitely I will be emailing you some questions as I research more into this as well, because I'm very interested in a lot of leads that you brought up, but it's too late. Matt's nodding his head. So I held back in asking any of my questions, and we'll definitely invite you on another time for a Hamlet lecture. That would be very nice. So next week we have myself. I will be doing a class on the Sunday on James Fenimore Cooper and political intelligence.
Oh,
and
wow, that's brilliant. Oh, sorry, may I just briefly?
Sure, yeah.
My wife and I have been going up and down the New Jersey Turnpike endlessly for the last 36 years to her sacred Slavic homeland up around exit 12. And the James Fenimore Cooper site is always where we stop for gas and coffee. and I realized he would not have appreciated that particular, connection, but it actually speaks to me. So I look forward to that. Thank you.
Yeah. And on Tuesday, Eamon McKinney, who's a new member of the Strategic Culture Foundation writers, he will be doing a presentation on the inevitable disintegration of the oligarchical model of social control and the emergence of a new paradigm of win-win cooperation. So that will be very interesting as well. He's lived in Asia for many years, started a business in China, and actually had talked to Deng Xiaoping. So be very interesting to see hear his insights on how things are going. All right, so thanks everyone for this presentation and your participation, and we'll see everybody next week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you, Marty.
Thank you, Martin.
Thanks, Marty.
Guys.
you.